This is a follow-up to a video I made recently about the N64 logo position on NTSC cartridges, and I pointed out there that this logo does not always appear in the same position, and in fact the bottom left corner is a very uncommon place to find that logo. So I was curious how many of these bottom left cartridges are there in the NTSC library. And based on my own collection, I predicted there would be about 7 of these. I have now gone through every cartridge. I checked them all online, and I found out there were actually a bit more than that. So there are 11 to 16 bottom left N64 cartridges. Now the reason this is a range and not an integer is because some of these are kind of like gray area borderline cases, or depending on your perspective, you might count these as bottom lefts, or you might just count them as their own separate thing. Regardless of your perspective, they're definitely worth mentioning and worth noting. So I'll go through them all. Now this is out of approximately, I say approximately, but 203 standard cartridges. I thought there were a little bit more because I was counting re-release cartridges before. I wasn't sure if those were actually separate printings or just the standard cartridge, but I'm pretty sure those were just the same. And then the rest of the library is like disk system stuff and smart media releases from Mario No Photo P, which we'll actually talk about a little bit later. And so in addition to those 16 that I'll touch on, there's also another cartridge I found, which is definitely not a bottom left, but is nonetheless completely unique within the N64 library. And I'll include it at the end as sort of the holy grail of N64 logo, strange positions. Okay, so first of all, here are all the bottom left cartridges in the NTSC library. First is Mario Party 2. This is the big one that shocked me because all the other Nintendo games are in the bottom right, but this is for some reason a bottom left. Then we have John Romero Daikatana, Shadowgate 64, Top Gear Hyperbike, another Top Gear game, Top Gear Rally 2, 64 Hanafuda, Aero Gauge, Extreme G, Rockman Dash, Chameleon Twist 2, Ide Yosuke no Mahjong Shuku, and now we're going to get into some of those gray area cases.
Neon Genesis Evangelion. Wow.
So this one you can see the logo is closest to the bottom left corner, but this is quite a bit higher up because there's some information underneath it. Now this is not that unusual, even among other types of positions, like Wonder Project J2 also has a relatively high logo, despite I would call this a bottom right. So I would call this a bottom left, but it's pretty high up there. So maybe if you're a very conservative logo purist, then maybe you wouldn't consider it. Igikun no Burabura Puyon. Pretty similar case here. It's a very high up, bottom left. And then Virtual Pro Wrestling 64. Again, just a very, very elevated bottom left N64 logo. This one's basically like a middle left situation, but it's as far down as it can go without overlapping the text. So I don't know, maybe you want to consider this a bottom left, maybe it's just a unique middle left cartridge. And then we have A Cold St. Andrews. Fairly early release for the N64 golf game. Now this one's pushed over to the right. It's down on the bottom, but more centered. And I don't know. This is pretty unique here. I don't know if you really want to consider this a bottom left or just a weird, unique cartridge. And then finally, Mario no Photopea. Now this one, the logo is clearly in the bottom left, but the question is, do you count this as an N64 cartridge? Because Mario no Photopea is more of like its own, weird, different kind of cartridge. If you're not familiar, this was like a Photoshop program. It's kind of like the Mario Paint of the N64, and you could buy separate smart media thingamajigs that you would like. They were like an SD card that you would put into this cartridge, and then you could Photoshop images from other franchises like Cardcaptor Sakura and whatnot. But it's definitely bottom left. It's just a question of whether you count this as a standard cartridge or not. So in total, these 16 games, I think, represent a nice slice of the N64 library. You've got a nice mix of different genres in there. You got some racing, some platforming, some shooting, sports, tabletop, and there are some very common games and very uncommon ones. So it's just a nice little collectible sliver of the N64 library. Some Japan exclusive games in there. So if you're wondering, like, what do I go for next? Well, like when you're collecting a lot, you always wonder, like, what should I target? What should I aim for? This is just kind of like a fun little selection to keep your eye on, because these bottom left logos are not very common. So now finally, the last thing I wanted to point out, a cartridge that is not a bottom left, but nonetheless is a unique position, and that's Shin Nippon Pro Wrestling Dokkan Road 2, the next generation. Now, as you can see here, that logo is not on the cartridge at all, making this completely one of a kind within the N64 library, or at least within the NTSC-GA library. I haven't checked other regions, but as far as Japan releases go, this is the only cartridge that does not have an N64 logo on it whatsoever. So, yeah, that's kind of interesting.